Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm really psyched and excited to be here. So over roughly the next 15 minutes, you're going to see what an engineer sees when he looks at a built environment and how do those same performance in the built environment actually translate to insured losses, which is what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. So as Dale just said, and thanks for that generous introduction. So we're going to look back at the 2017 and 2018 hurricane season in the United States. Given that I have 15 minutes, we're going to actually focus on Florida because Florida gave us a unique opportunity in different parts of the state to look at how the built environment performed. And we're going to be looking at all of this with the lens of the building code that is in effect in Florida. So trying to look at what the building code says and does that actually translate in terms of performance of the residential building stock today. And then I'll leave you with some parting thoughts, something to think about as we all leave the room today. So before we dive deep and look at how different types of residential buildings behaved, let's very quickly take sort of a 101 lesson about the history of building codes in Florida. So it was the year 1974 where the Florida legislature actually adopted a state minimum building code law. Now what this means in plain English is the state took up the responsibility of adopting one of the 4 different codes. So it looked at the latest editions of some of those. It took it upon itself to adopt them, and then it left the adoption and enforcement practices to the local counties or to the local towns. The local towns could pick up any one of those 4 codes, they could amend them, and they had the responsibility of enforcing them. But in the year 1992, Hurricane Andrew, it literally shattered everything. All hell broke loose. And the state actually realized that its own responsibility was not to adopt one of the 4 building codes, but it had far-reaching implications in terms of enforcing them, and the enforcement actually had statewide, if not federal-wide consequences. So after 1992, in the year 1996, the state actually recommended and appointed a building code commission. And the whole role of the Building Code Commission was to understand what exists in all these different model codes and to try and encompass them into one document, which could then form the basis for the statewide building code that would then be enforced. And all of this took shape in the year 2002, where the Florida Building Code version 2001 was first adopted in the year 2002, and thereafter for every 3 years, the Building Code Commission and the state building departments have been adopting a code. Now, some of these codes are pretty much the same in terms of language with very little amendments that might or might not have to do anything with wind resistance. So that's what I show you in this step diagram here. So all the way from 2002 to the year 2017, there have been different versions of the Florida Building Code. Now, although you see 6 different documents here, there is a material difference when you look at the 2002 version, which was the very first edition of the Florida Building Code, and the 2010 version of the FBC, which is the 4th edition of the Building Code. Now, as engineers, what are we usually trying to look at when we take a look at some of these building codes can be classified into those 3 big buckets that I showed you on the top of the slide here. We're trying to look for guidance on what is the required minimum design wind speed at an individual location. These are something, so the pressures that come out of these design wind speeds are what your buildings are expected to be designed for, what they are supposed to withstand. We are looking not only in terms of the building, we are also trying to look at what surrounds your building. Like, are you located right at the water? Do you just have open exposure in front of you? Are you located in a suburban area? Are you located in downtown Miami, where you could expect a lot of turbulence and disturbance to the flow of wind? So that's what I mean by terrain exposure. And then we are looking for some guidance about wind-borne debris regions. So these are regions which are specified in the Florida Building Code, and very soon you'll see that it's very political in terms of definitions or inclusions or exclusions of wind-borne debris. But these are areas primarily along the coast where you are susceptible to flying debris, and you're supposed to protect your openings and your envelopes to withstand the impacts of these debris. So let's now walk through some of these. So here you're seeing this beautiful coastal community in Big Pine Key, Florida. So this is how it looked before Irma, and this is how it looks after Irma. Now, this is entirely a residential neighborhood. And when people come and talk to me and they tell me, I think the damage in residential can be expected. It's fairly homogeneous. And the first thing I tell them is there's absolutely nothing homogeneous as to how residential homes perform in a windstorm. And we have seen this time and again from Irma, we have seen this from Andrew, we have seen this from Charlie, we have seen this from Wilma, and we continue to see this in Irma and Michael just a few weeks ago. So when you look at the fundamental damage mechanisms, like what happens to a residential building, or as a matter of fact, what happens to a commercial building when it's subjected to winds from hurricanes, you can put them under these three different buckets. Now, we refer to this in the technical jargon as internal pressurization. We say that issues that are stemming when the load path or the flow of forces is not continuous from the roof as it goes through the walls and then into the foundation. And then we are looking at some localized failures. Now, what do I mean by internal pressurization? Imagine your home to be like a balloon. The moment you have an opening into that balloon, you're just filling air into the balloon. And at one point, the skin of your balloon just gives up. It just blasts open. That's exactly what internal pressurization is. The moment you leave any one of your opening exposed, or you leave air to fill into this home, it at some point is going to break open if that air just keeps blowing on and on. So duration is a very important aspect. Then lack of a continuous load path. This is where your connections come into play. If your roofs are not very well anchored to your walls, if your walls are not anchored well into the foundation, there is not going to be a continuous flow of forces and your envelope is going to break open. Winds usually tend to pull things away. They impact what we call a suction force. So if your members, if the skin of your building is not designed enough to withstand your suction forces, this is where your gable ends of your roofs give up. This is where your wall siding peels off. This is where your asphalt shingles or your metal roofs give up. So typically you can classify failures into one of these three things. But when I look at it from an insurance world or when I look at it from a loss world, it's not as important to identify these different damage mechanisms because the consequences are the same. You are leaving the interiors of your building, you're leaving the elements of your building exposed to the elements of the weather, and you're looking at humongous amount of losses that come from these events. So take a look at this roof system. This is in Blue Water Key, Florida. Now, why do you see what you're seeing here? Is again because of some of those connections. Although the Florida Building Code requires you to connect roof covers to your roof decking and roof decking to your wall elements, here is a classic example of what was not done, and this is what actually happens. Now, when this happens, this is how your interiors look like, and believe me, I don't think any one of us want to live in an environment that we are being subjected to in this way. Now, here is a classic example from Panama City, Florida, where there's not even a roof deck. So you're seeing a metal roof that's directly being pinned on, or it's directly being nailed to a trough system without a roof deck. And this is not what you expect to see in Florida, which tends to be the pioneer when it comes to wind design in the country. So there are numerous examples. I can spend hours with you talking about these examples when we look at Irma or even Maria in Puerto Rico, or when we look at Florence in the Carolinas. Now, metal panel roofs. Over the last few days, I heard a lot of talk about metal panel roofs. Again, don't get me wrong. Metal panel roofs are much better to resist wind forces when you compare them to their asphalt shingle or even to their clay metal or to their clay tile counterparts. But then the success or failure of these metal roof coverings entirely depends on what fasteners are used to pin them down, what the gauge of some of these metal panels are. Now, screws, as all of us know, provide a better pull-off resistance than ring shack nails. But there were cases where we didn't even see ring shack nails. Now, again, there was a very classic regional difference we could see in Florida. Now, the performance of metal roofs in the areas that Irma affected, in the Florida Keys, in Miami-Dade counties, in the Naples area, was a lot better than the performance of metal panel roofs in the Panhandle. Now, we were thinking, why would this be the case? It's still the same state. It's still bound by the same building code. And there were a lot of reasons for it. Now, one thing was this roof overs. Now, I was in a session during the panel yesterday, and Ann Cope rightly said, roofs are designed to perform the way they are required to perform when you connect them to what they are supposed to be attached to. Now, metal panel roofs do an excellent job when they are connected to a substrate, which is a roof deck. metal panel roofs don't perform well when you connect them to an older roof cover, which is an asphalt shingle in this case. So what the homeowner actually did, it looks like, is he just strapped on a metal panel roof to a bunch of 2x4s and nailed them down to an older asphalt roof. And this is exactly what you see. And this is what you're supposed to see under such circumstances. A lot of success in the Panhandle also depended on when you actually had a standing seam metal roof, or was it just a corrugated metal roof? A standing seam metal roof is where you crimp metal panels together. And we did not see a lot of cases of that happening. So again, here you're looking at a regional difference between the performance of these good roof cover materials. Metal roofs are supposed to be good performers, but then you don't see the benefit of having them in the Panhandle versus you saw them in the Keys area. Now, I was telling you that the wind-borne debris, which is another thing that the building codes point us to, it's extremely political. And these pictures here are to illustrate that aspect. So Florida Building Code 2001, so this is the first edition of the Florida Building Code that was in force since the year 2002. Now, it made a political decision to exclude large swaths of the Panhandle from the so-called wind-borne debris region. I don't know why. We are lucky that this region did not see a massive event from 2001 to 2004, but unfortunately, none of the areas that Michael impacted were within the wind-borne debris region, according to the Florida Building Code 2001. Now, this decision was revised in the year 2004, but then in the building code update of the year 2010, we again see that significant swaths of the Florida Panhandle are excluded from the wind-borne debris requirements. And this is what the picture on the right shows you. So every region that is highlighted in red tells you regions that used to be in the wind-borne debris region and that are now excluded from the wind-borne debris region. And you see that almost all of these regions that are excluded now from the wind-borne debris region are in the Florida Panhandle. And we actually saw consequences of this during Michael. So here is a case, and I can show you numerous examples of flying debris that impact openings in the building, and then the openings just crack. They leave a big hole in there, and then you have the wind that is filling up this home. And as I was giving you the balloon analogy, now when air is feeding into these envelopes, you see that at one point the roof just gives up. The roof flies away from the envelope. Another stark difference we saw was in the performance of garage doors. Again, this was another area that we looked at pretty closely when we looked at the Florida Keys versus the Panhandle, and when we looked at cases of the same in Miami-Dade and Broward counties. Now, you saw a lot of garage door failures. Again, the doors were either pulled out or they were pushed in, and we refer to this as buckling. So the doors either buckled inwards or outwards. And we did not see a lot of this happening in the Miami area. And one reason could again be Miami-Dade and Broward counties together constitute the high-velocity hurricane zone. It's a special category that is awarded to these counties, I guess recognizing their hurricane potential, and the gauge requirements. The requirements for garage doors in these areas are much stricter and very much different from some of these other parts of the state, and we again saw that being reflected in terms of their performance. And again, I don't have to tell you guys, manufactured homes, irrespective of where they were completely obliterated, be it the Florida Keys, be it the Panhandle. And although the requirements for manufactured homes, how these are constructed, how these are held down, although these have changed with time, I feel there's a lot that could still be done in order to make their performance better. Now let's swing away from wind for a few minutes and look at storm surge. And again, here is a snapshot of Mexico Beach. And what you're seeing here is a consequence of storm surge. Wind might have very much caused some damage to these buildings, but when you see nothing existing and things were existing before, it is the fury that water brings in. Now, you look at this building and you might tell me, oh, it should perform well because it's well elevated on piles and stilts. This is in Isla Morada, but this is what happened to this building. So at the very first moment when we looked at it, we didn't even know that this was a condominium building that was elevated on piles. We thought this was probably a single family home that was sitting on a slab foundation. So what I want to impress upon you is while stilts and piles are good foundation types, they are the way to go when you're building right along the beach, when you're building right on the water. You might want to also think about the embedment of some of these piles or stilts into the ground, because surge has a tendency to cause a lot of erosion. It tends to remove all the soil that is around this pile material, and there's nothing to bear on. and the whole building just collapses, like you saw in this case of the condo building. But then there are cases of good performance. So here is very new set of elevated condominium or multifamily homes and single-family homes in the upper Sugarloaf Key part of Florida. They were left with not even a drop of water inside these homes. As you see, the mechanical equipment are well elevated, much beyond the base flood elevation in some of these areas and the freeboard requirements. So this tells you that if you follow the requirements of the building codes for both wind and storm surge, you can mitigate damage. It is not impossible. I want to leave you with this parting thought. So here is a snapshot of a FEMA flood map for the city of Mexico Beach. Now, even if you don't understand the different classifications here, we have something called the high velocity zones, V zones. We have the coastal A zones, you have the inland A zones, and then you have the X zones. So this is what is shown in some of these maps. So if you look at the piece, I unfortunately don't have a pointer here, but if you look at the piece on the lower left side of the screen, you see that a large swath of area there in Mexico Beach is not designated as falling within a V zone or an A zone. And here are images of that very same area. There's nothing left in there. Here is an aerial imagery. This is that exact same region that was not even designated as a V zone or an A zone according to the FEMA flood maps in that area. Now, why do I point to FEMA flood maps? The building codes refer to these same FEMA flood maps in order to locate you, in order to specify a location as to where you're supposed to locate your livable floor in the building. Now, I'm not here to judge because I've not done the analysis. So this raises a few questions. Number one, clearly the extent of storm surge from Hurricane Michael and also many such areas that Irma subjected its fury to went well beyond the FEMA designated V zones and A zones. It went into these X zones, which means the level of flood hazard could be beyond the 500-year event. So further studies are certainly needed to ascertain if the FEMA flood maps are indeed deficient, do we need to revise them? Or if it was a reality that the Hurricane Michael surge in this area went beyond the 500-year event. This is something that is still work in progress, but I do want to point this thing out. A similar thing, my friends there in the back do a lot of really good work looking at B6. Now, why is B6 important? B6 is extremely important because adoption of building codes is important, but equally, if not more important thing is how good these building codes are enforced. Now, B6 is a very neat score that puts your community on a scale from 0 to 100 or 1 to 10. And they look at a score that essentially blends in three very important topics. How is the administration of building codes? Are the building codes adopted as is? Are they weakened? Or do you not even have a building code? Are there any practices in place to review your plans? Are there any field inspection requirements in some of these communities? And if you look at it, here is how that score looks like when you plot them on a county level. Again, Louisiana and Mississippi have weird rules when it comes to data sharing. That's why you see these big holes in this data set. But every color here on the screen tells you how that individual community performs from all those three aspects that I just looked at. Another thought I want you to leave with is AIR today, or Verisk today, has to the tune of $15 billion in location level claims. So we know a street address, we know what claim that location experienced from these 4 hurricanes of the last 2 years. So Irma, Florence, Michael, and Harvey. Now, we can very quickly try and correlate what the claim experience relates to what is the underlying B6 score within the community. We have already been halfway through this process, and it's already coming out to be a clear signal that those communities where you might still have a building code, but there is no enforcement, are bearing the brunt when it comes to the performance and the reflection of how these buildings do when they are subjected to hurricane events. So let me leave you with one parting thought. There is a lot of uncertainty in terms of how strong these hurricanes are going to get or where they are going to strike along the Florida coast. Or sometimes in inland areas, they might still subject their fury, and we might not be able to answer these questions today. But there is one thing that we certainly know, that if we follow the building codes, if we enforce them, and if we build according to them, the desired performance will be met. It's not just about life safety, it's also about economic safety when it comes to these disasters. So thanks for your attention, and I really, really thank you for this opportunity.